I'm thrilled that you're joining me here. My name is Marilyn Evans. I'm the founder of Parents Aware and host of the Media Savvy Moms podcast, the podcast that is leading the conversation about parenting and pornography today. The purpose of the Media Savvy Moms podcast is to help parents have open, honest conversations with their children and teens about the realities of growing up in a media-saturated world, which is a pornified world. And along with providing solutions and tools to have those conversations, we also gather information. We try to educate ourselves and build awareness about issues that are often overlooked or hidden in our society. And these topics can be very challenging to address and to take in. And I know on this show, we often talk about the harms of pornography in general terms, but today we're going to get more specific and answer the following questions. Does pornography influence behavior? Could it cause children to act out sexually? And is there a connection between early exposure to pornography and child-on-child sexual abuse? And I am so grateful that we have an incredible guest today. Her name is Heidi Olson, and she's here to help us answer those questions. So welcome, Heidi.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, Heidi, you've got quite a few letters beside your name. I'm going to read them off. You have MSN, RN, CPN, and SANE-P. That's SANE-P. SANE stands for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner. And I know you're going to get into that in more detail in a minute. And you are the program manager at Children's Mercy Hospital. So that is why we have you here today. Why don't you just start by telling us a little bit more about what a SANE nurse is and what led you to that specialty?
Sure. So SANE nursing is a very unique type of nursing. It's a subspecialty. It's not very common. I just looked this up yesterday. There are only about 540 SANE-P nurses in the United States. So definitely rare, and they do practice all around the world, so they are in other countries as well. But essentially all that means is that at my hospital, when kids come in with a disclosure of sexual abuse or something has been witnessed, they'll be seen by one of our nurses, and we collect forensic evidence off of kids' bodies after a sexual assault to help with the criminal justice system to find corroborating evidence. We make sure kids are safe and healthy, which is really our main priority. We want to make sure that holistically they are doing okay and stable before they leave our doors. We provide them and their families with resources, so therapy, and even if they need a ride home or food or whatever it may be, we try and meet those basic needs before they go. And then we also get subpoenaed to testify in court. So in a nutshell, that is what we do day in and day out. We see kids ages 0 through 18. And before COVID, we used to be one of the busiest SANE programs for kids in the United States. COVID has changed our numbers a little bit, which is the trend nationally. But that's kind of what we do. The reason that I decided to become a SANE and specifically to work with kids is I love working with kids. There's just a level of resiliency and joy that they still have. I did work in the adult nursing world for a little while and I hated it. Adults are jaded and angry and they can be very entitled. And I think with kids, there's a spark about life still, that they can joke around with me or we can build rapport even during such a horrific tragedy that's happening. So I really love working with kids. I decided to become a SANE because I actually had a huge interest in human trafficking and wanted to know as a nurse how I could help with that, which certainly I do a lot with trafficking as well, but it actually has opened this entire world to seeing the way pornography is related to sexual assault that I did not see coming when I signed up for this, but I'm thankful for, just the opportunities and the data that we've been able to collect.
So you said there's only 540 SANE pediatric nurses across the United States, but give us an idea of the volume of children that you see through your hospital?
So on average, our nurses see about 400 sexual assault victims a year. These are just acute sexual assault victims, meaning the sexual assault just happened. If it's been more than 5 days, there typically isn't DNA for us to collect off of kids' bodies anymore. And so if kids are past that time frame, they're seen in our child abuse clinic instead, and they see over 1,000 sexual assault victims a year. So between our two programs, we're seeing hundreds of kids every year. And these are just kids who have disclosed, or again, that it's been a witnessed event. We know the majority of people don't disclose for years or even really until adulthood. So we're definitely not capturing the true number of children who are being sexually assaulted.
That's pretty overwhelming, those numbers. And my heart goes out to those who are listening that this is new information for, but I really think that it's important that we share that information. I personally was not aware of the extent of it. And I know, as you say, that that's just what is known. And there's so much more. Children are vulnerable in our society, and that's why we're doing what we're doing. We're trying to spread awareness and do everything that we can to help protect children, as you are, Heidi. So what are one of the myths that you would like to dispel today about child sexual abuse? We've had in the past a guest, Holly Ann Martin, on, and she was wonderful, safe for kids. And she helped us understand that this type of abuse usually occurs by someone who is known and loved by the child, or known and trusted by the child, not that stranger danger that we've grown up knowing. But what would you want to add to that?
Yeah. Oh, first, I love Holly Ann. She's awesome. And that's such a great myth to dispel, which I can absolutely corroborate and say we see the same thing. It's not stranger danger. But probably the biggest myth that I spend my time dismantling, whether that's with parents, juries, police officers, colleagues, I feel like I give this talk every day, is most people think that if a child has been sexually abused or if there has been some type of penetration, there will be a genital injury. Like in their mind, if this happens, then there has to be an injury, which makes sense if you think about like physical abuse. Typically, we can see it. If a kid gets hit really hard, they're going to have a bruise or a broken arm or something like that. So the truth is, the vast majority of kids do not have injuries after a sexual assault. And what research has shown decade after decade, and even what we see with our own patients, is that about 90 to 95% of kids who are sexually assaulted, they will not have an injury, even when there's penetration. So that means the most kids I see that I'm collecting evidence from, that I'm doing a thorough genital exam, I don't see any injuries. And I don't expect to see injuries because that's not typically the normal finding. So a lot of people are like, that makes no sense to me. So to give you a little more context of why we don't see injuries. One, perpetrators purposefully do not hurt kids because they want continued access. So they are going to sexually assault a child in a way where it's not painful. It's not creating bruising. It's not creating bleeding, because a caregiver would be suspicious if they saw that. And so a perpetrator, they're very manipulative and think through what they're doing. The other piece to this is that
would be, sorry, I imagine that would be maybe an adult perpetrator who is
yes, absolutely
aware of.
Yes, that's a great distinction. So that in that case, that's like a probably long time adult perpetrator who's done this multiple times, where they've kind of learned from their mistakes and it's very well thought out. Yes, great point. The other piece is that even if an injury is created, genital tissues heal so incredibly fast. So genitals are made out of mucosal tissue, which is the same tissue on the inside of your mouth. And if you've ever bit the inside of your mouth really hard, it hurts, it may bleed, it heals within days. And you typically don't have a scar. You really can't see where you bit it a few days later. The same thing's true of the genitals, that maybe there is a laceration or a bruise. Maybe it is painful 2 or 3 days later. Say I look at a child, it's completely healed and I can't tell. And lastly, probably the biggest barrier is that a lot of people were taught that, specifically with females, that there is a hymen, that when there's penetration, that a membrane is broken, so that there will be some type of bleeding, that you can tell if someone is a virgin or not, and that is not true. I can say wholeheartedly, after seeing thousands and thousands of genital exams, there is no membrane over the hymen. So the hymen is a ring of tissue that is the entrance to the vagina, but it's open from the day that females are born. And it has to be. If you think about it, when females go through puberty and start their period, blood has to come out. And so there has to be an opening for blood to come out. So sometimes there is bleeding or there is a lot of pain. And that's because that ring of tissue, when penetration happens, it tears on this bottom piece, but it's not because there's a membrane there. And typically those tears heal very quickly. And again, somebody would never be able to look at genital tissue and say they've had sex or not, they've been penetrated or not, unless they were highly trained, like a SANE nurse, a child abuse doctor, an OBGYN, and even in those instances, sometimes we can't say. So a lot of those myths that surround, popping cherries and all of those things are not true. And I would say I spend the majority of my time giving that same spiel, unfortunately.
Now, that leads me to a question. I've had a couple of thoughts while you're explaining that. First, that it makes your job incredibly difficult, I imagine. But you're explaining this, is that because there's a belief factor that we need to address?
Yes, excellent point. So what happens, and probably the reason why I am sort of preaching this at you, is because for most people that come in saying, I want to know if my child was touched or not, and if there's no injuries, then phew, nothing happened. And that's not true. If a child makes a disclosure, it's extremely serious. We need to believe them. What we know from research is that kids typically do not lie about a sexual assault, and especially little kids, they don't have the context to make that up. For little kids, they have to know about something to be able to lie about it. So they don't know about sex, they shouldn't know about anything sexual. So they can't just magically make up something about a sexual assault. It's likely something has happened to them. But unfortunately, for a lot of kids, people don't believe them. They dismiss it. They say that kids, they have magical thinking, so this can't be real. And we know that that's not true. And so even if a child doesn't have a genital injury, but they've made a disclosure, we believe them. The genital injury is not going to change the fact that we believe them and are going to move forward with acting like this happened because we believe that it did. But it can be very difficult with juries because they want to see a genital injury to prosecute someone or to convict someone. And so I spend a lot of time testifying as well, saying I wouldn't expect to see, an injury with this type of assault. And I've had patients where they acquit the defendant because they just cannot wrap their minds around that. And that's so discouraging.
That would be discouraging. That's so important. Actually, I've taught preschool for a few years, and that stood out in my mind. It wasn't related to inappropriate touch or anything, but I remember the principal saying, in your kindergarten class, those 5-year-olds are really not capable of lying. And I love that you reinforce that with, they need to know, they have to have context, and without, if they're talking about this, that means there's trauma of some kind.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
That's really, really important. I appreciate that. Okay. So my question at the beginning was, what makes children act out sexually towards other children? I kind of feel like I just jumped right in there because we were just talking about perhaps adult perpetrators, but is that everything that you see in your practice or in your hospital?
So I went into this job very naively thinking, I'm going to be seeing kids where the perpetrator's the 60-year-old creep who lives in his parents' basement and he's luring kids down there, with like kittens and lollipops or whatever. And maybe that happens once in a while, but those stereotypes are really not that accurate. What's the dots just really started to click that as soon as I became a SANE nurse, we write down the perpetrators' ages. And for me, it was young kids who were committing sexual assault. So I'm writing down 10, 12, 14, 11. Time after time after time, the people committing the sexual assaults were kids themselves. And so for me, I am very inquisitive and I want to know why. Like, I always want to know, why is something happening? Why does this exist? And so that's exactly where my mind went, was what is going on in our society that so many kids are violently sexually acting out on other kids? And why are we not talking about this? And is this just happening in a silo here in Kansas City? Like, is this happening everywhere? So I just started to dive into, so we have a database and we keep as much information as we can about our patients to look at trends and, kind of use that internally just to help our program grow. So I got permission to look at the data and I dived in and I started looking at how old are our perpetrators. And so our program just breaks down perpetrator ages. And starting in 2015 till now, so COVID has not changed this trend, the age group that has the most people in it, or like the most concentrated group of people. So if you were to, take lines and draw out how long each, section of perpetrators is, the line that is the longest every time are 11 to 15-year-old males. And so they're not necessarily committing the majority of the assaults, but if you look at age ranges, they have the most concentrated group of perpetrators. And this is kind of hard to explain without a graphic, but what you should take away is a lot of 11 to 15-year-olds are committing sexual assaults.
Okay.
And so I think for me, my mind just went to why? What is happening that, and I'm talking about normal sexual development. It's not like a 10-year-old saying, hey, show me your parts and I'll show you mine. I'm talking about violent, like holding someone down and penetrating them type of assault that is not normal. So my mind went to, okay, historically, when kids sexually act out like this in problematic ways, it's because they've been sexually assaulted. That's what we were always taught. I think a lot of people in our multidisciplinary team were taught that. But the internet, I think, has changed things. And we are seeing kids who commit violent sexual acts who have not been sexually abused, to our knowledge, who don't have a lot of risk factors. What they have is a screen, and they are addicted to pornography. And I think that's really alarming because I don't know that this has always been a trend. And porn may not be the only factor. There's multiple things going on. So you have a kid maybe with an attachment disorder, or a kid who has a hard time controlling compulsions, or a kid who doesn't have coping skills, and they're addicted to porn. What is going to happen if they act out what they're seeing? We know kids imitate adults. They get their context of how to behave from us. So if they are watching violent sex acts all the time, it is not a stretch to think they're going to act it out when they get an opportunity, which unfortunately sometimes is on a younger sibling, a cousin, a schoolmate, whoever it may be. And so I think that's definitely the concerning trend that we're starting to put the pieces together to say pornography is playing a huge role in the sexual behavior of kids, and it's scary.
Are you able to share with us what it's like to have a family come in where there is both the victim and the perpetrator, and you're examining the child?
Yes. So if we find out the perpetrator is present, and I guess I'll give the caveat, I know we're talking about kids here, so the correct terminology is probably like kids with problematic sexual behavior. I know perpetrator is really harsh. So I will acknowledge that. I'm used to that language, so I kind of just naturally go there. But so if a kid is brought in that has been the aggressor, they are not allowed to stay in the emergency department just for the safety of the child that we're taking care of. But I absolutely can explain the fallout, and it's horrific. And so say we have a 3-year-old who discloses that her 12-year-old brother, touched her private parts. So we see the 3-year-old. And so what's happening as we're examining this 3-year-old and talking to the parents and getting consent and all this is we have social workers working with us who are trying to figure out a safety plan, because now we need to figure out, is it safe for that 3 and that 12-year-old to be in the same home? Can a parent watch that 12-year-old all of the time? Is that even feasible? I would say no. In most homes, probably not. You can't watch your two kids 24/7. What are the sleeping arrangements? Do they share a room? Would you have to quit your job to now monitor your kids all of the time? So it's like once that safety plan goes in place, it can wreck families. Or the solution is, well, we have to take this 12-year-old out of the home now because it's not safe for him to be there while we're investigating. So he's going to have to go stay with grandma, or, if that's not an option, he needs to go stay in a group home for a little while, or whatever it may be while he's getting therapy and they're assessing sort of the dynamics at home. So I have absolutely seen this wreck families. Not only is this traumatic for the 3-year-old who has now been sexually abused, we need to address the mental health of the 12-year-old. Why would he do this? And, what are the solutions in place to be able to get him help? And then as a parent, how do you parent one child who has victimized the other? It's a nightmare for families when this happens. And I feel so much empathy for parents because you love both of your kids. How do you navigate it? I mean, every time, and I've seen this happen hundreds of times, it happens, I just feel sick to my stomach for everybody involved because there's not this easy straight road of like, do this, this, and this. Everyone's world is wrecked in that moment, and it is not easy to put the pieces back together.
Okay, so wrecked in that moment, you love both your children. It's not an easy solution. What solutions are there? And I'm glad you mentioned that not a child perpetrator, but a child with problematic sexual behaviors. How do you see the recovery of both? I know you don't see that through, that's not your job, but are you aware of how each side is able to recover? Is that possible?
Yes, it is. So I will say, as heavy and hard as all of this is, and I know that it is, there is absolutely hope. I think especially for the kids who have committed a sexual assault, if you look at the recidivism rate or the rate at which they will reoffend, it's extremely low, especially when they're in a specialized therapy program. It's less than 3%. So that's really hopeful that these kids aren't going to go on to be repeat offenders. That's not true if you look at adult perpetrators. Their recidivism rate is much higher. And so I think with kids, there is that hope of, can we get to the root of what is causing this behavior and turn things around? And I think the same with a kid who has been sexually abused and traumatized, to be able to address that trauma and provide support, they can go on to live a great, productive life. That doesn't mean that either of these things stop these kids from being thriving adults if it's addressed correctly. I think in families where it's ignored, where one child is not protected, where a child with a porn addiction continues on in that addiction, that may not be the case. But if we're talking best case scenarios, yes. So we, the way it works in our city, which we're very lucky to have this resource, is that for a lot of kids with problematic sexual behavior, rather than going through the criminal justice system, our juvenile system says, let's get you into therapy. So for a lot of kids who have sexually acted out in inappropriate ways, they go to group therapy. It's several months long. The parents are required to go to. It's free, which is awesome. And I think it really helps these kids to be able to get to the root of things. They address pornography. They understand the influence that it has in all of this. And they've seen really, really good results. But a lot of places don't have those resources. If you're not familiar with Kansas City, we are an urban area surrounded by rural areas. So if a kid's lucky enough to live close by, they can come to therapy. If they live 3 hours away and we happen to be the closest, children's hospital to them, sometimes it's like, we don't know where to send you. So that is a very real thing, is there may not always be specialized programs for kids with problematic sexual behavior. And then, of course, we always encourage the child who has been victimized to be in therapy as well. And a lot of families about following up with that. Some families do great and they really put an effort. In some families, there's already so much trauma and dysfunctioning happening in the home. Everyone's in survival mode, and those things don't get addressed, unfortunately.
Yeah, that makes sense. But sounds like there's a great need to increase awareness so that we can increase the availability of services to families, for those families that are wanting to and able to get the help they need for their children. So what can we do? What can every parent do to make a difference in their own home and in their community? We might say, well, this is not my kid, this is not my issue. What can we do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's several things that we can do, which I'm sure you guys are all aware, but I think the first thing starts with awareness. And so that means, do we know what kids are doing online? Because a huge part of this problem stems from kids having complete unchecked freedom online, that whether they, are wanting to look at pornography out of curiosity or pornography finds them, if it goes unchecked, then worst case scenario, it leads to exactly what I'm describing here. Not every kid is going to end up sexually assaulting another kid that sees porn. That's not what I'm saying. But we see horrific health consequences because of pornography, influences, exploitation, just on and on. There's so many damaging things pornography is doing with kids. And so I think obviously being aware of what kids are doing online is huge. Like, stop the problem before it escalates to what I'm talking about. I think the other thing is taking away the stigma around this. And so for a lot of parents, I know that it's like, I just don't want to go there. I don't want to think about sexual assault. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to address this. I have had families where they don't believe the child who's disclosing, because it's so much easier to say this child is a liar versus saying this child just committed a sexual assault. What do we do with that? Mm-hmm. And so it's a lot easier to just say, nah, that didn't happen. Let's move on. And that's traumatizing for both kids who desperately need help. And so I think to be able to take away some of the stigma and shame around this is huge, so that people can talk about it. They can get help. They can get resources. I think for a lot of parents, they just stuff it down. It's never happened. Let's move on. And that doesn't help anybody.
So if you're listening and you've made it to the end of this episode, you get a gold star for that, because you are paying attention, you're listening. And I know that, what we're doing here is to have those open conversations with our kids so that they don't get to that point. I've heard it said it takes all kinds to protect our children. And Heidi, what you're doing is you're offering them the care that they need after an assault. Well, we're trying desperately to protect them from even ending up in that place. And both sides of this conversation are so needed. Yes, we have to remove the stigma. So just to recap, and then we're going to get you to give our parents a challenge for this week, is that you talked about myths. You talked about the sexual assault injuries are not always visible, and we think that they are, but we need to really believe the words of a child, because they are not inclined to make this up. They don't have the information, prior information, to even make it up with. So if a child or anyone talks about sexual assault, we need to listen and believe. You talked about the age of perpetrators, and we also use the word children with problematic sexual behaviors, but in this case the perpetrators are ages 11 to 15-year-olds. Those are the most consistent that you're seeing in your hospital. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Yep.
And then we talked about getting help, and that the programs are not always available, but the more we build awareness in our communities, the more we remove the stigma from this conversation, that is what's going to help children get the services that they need. So the more we can talk about this, the better. All right, what kind of challenge do you have for us today?
So the challenge that I have, well, I guess I will go back and say I should have thrown this in when I was talking about the ages of kids we see committing sexual assaults, that we see this as a national and really global trend, so that it is not just happening here in the Midwest of the United States. If you look at research and you look at trends elsewhere, this is global to everyone, so it does apply, which goes to my challenge. So my challenge is to sit with this for a few minutes. I know that it's unpleasant. I know that it brings up hard feelings. I know that it's just such a horrible thing to think about, but to sit with it for a few minutes and think about, if this happened in my world, if one of my kids sexually assaulted another one, or if my niece sexually assaulted my other niece, or whatever it may be, if this scenario happened in my world, how would I want someone to respond to me? And to have that language already, so that if someone does disclose to you, instead of that gut response of like, no, that can't be true, or like, you shouldn't talk about that, or whatever, which ends up being more traumatizing, we have responses that are empathetic. And that is really how we break the stigma. Saying things like, I'm so sorry. How can I help? That sounds horrific. What do you need? That's extremely helpful to someone who is in the midst of a huge crisis. Our disbelief or sort of being overwhelmed by it is not helpful. And so I think to prepare for what would I want someone to say to me is so helpful in the moment to be able to give to somebody else.
I think it's so important to put yourself in that position, hopefully never to have to use it, but to have the empathy and compassion for those who do have to deal with it, and to be prepared, because this can happen in any family. No family is immune from this, unfortunately. Thank you so much for being here today, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule. It was great to have you here.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you again for joining the conversation. If you'd like more information about what was discussed in this episode, visit our detailed show notes at parentsaware.info. And if you simply want to follow us on social media, we are at Media Savvy Moms on Instagram and parentsaware /Media Savvy Moms podcast on Facebook. Until next time, keep talking.